Bone-deep exhaustion doesn't care about danger. It doesn't care that the man stepping over the shattered glass is Declan Walsh, a man who owns half the city and the politicians who run it. When your knees finally give out after a 20-hour shift, scrubbing sins out of marble floors, you just fall. Sophia fell. She expected the cold impact of the tile. She didn't expect to wake up hours later in a silk-sheeted bed, her calloused fingers locked in the iron grip of a ruthless killer. The grandfather clock in the main foyer struck 3 in the morning, the heavy chime reverberating through the empty halls of the Walsh estate. Sophia Reed didn't look up. She was on her hands and knees in the secondary dining room, a toothbrush gripped tightly in her right hand, scrubbing a dark, tacky stain out of the intricate grooves of the hardwood floor. It was blood. She knew it was blood. It had the distinct, metallic copper smell that cut right through the sharp citrus scent of her industrial cleaner. 2 years ago, when she first took the job, a stain like this would have sent her into a panic. She would have locked herself in the downstairs supply closet, hyperventilating, wondering if she was an accessory to murder just by holding a bottle of bleach. Now, at 24, burdened by a mountain of her late sister's medical debt and facing eviction every month, her cynicism had thoroughly calloused her conscience. Murder was above her pay grade. Getting the stain out before the morning staff arrived was her only concern. Sophia sat back on her heels and wiped the back of her forearm across her forehead. Her muscles screamed. A dull, throbbing ache had settled at the base of her spine 12 hours ago, and it was slowly radiating down her legs. The Walsh estate was less a home and more a fortress built for a king who trusted no one. It was massive, cold, and entirely devoid of warmth. Everything was mahogany, marble, and glass. Everything showed fingerprints. Everything showed dust. And the men who occupied it, Declan Walsh and his inner circle of tailored, dead-eyed lieutenants, were careless. They moved through the house like a storm, leaving behind cigar ash, half-empty glasses of scotch, shattered plates, and occasionally worse things. She tossed the toothbrush into her plastic caddy and grabbed a rag to wipe down the baseboards. She was supposed to clock out at midnight, but there had been a meeting. That's what the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, called them. The boss is having a meeting in the West Wing. Stay out of sight, but be ready. Sophia despised the meetings. They meant shouting that echoed through the vents. They meant the heavy thud of furniture overturning. They meant staying until dawn to erase the evidence of violent men doing violent things. She finally stood, her knees popping loud enough to echo in the cavernous room. She picked up her caddy. The house was dead quiet now. The cars had peeled out of the gravel driveway an hour ago. The soldiers had retreated to their quarters. Only Declan Walsh remained upstairs in the master wing, a place Sophia was strictly forbidden from entering. She didn't care about Declan Walsh. The other maids whispered about him in the laundry room. They talked about his broad shoulders, his sharp jawline, the cold, calculating way he looked at people. They romanticized the danger. Sophia thought they were idiots. Declan wasn't a romance novel protagonist. He was a stone-cold pragmatist who didn't know how to load a dishwasher and left his dirty, blood-specked shirts on the floor for someone else to pick up. He was just another wealthy boss, and she was just a ghost pushing a mop. Sophia dragged her feet toward the kitchen. She needed to put her supplies away, sign the ledger, and walk the 2 miles in the freezing rain to the bus stop. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit by motion sensor sconces. The air conditioning was always set to a frigid 65 degrees. She shivered in her thin, gray uniform. Her vision blurred at the edges. She blinked hard, trying to force the fatigue away. Just 10 more minutes, she told herself. Put the caddy away. Get your coat. She turned the corner into the expansive library to take the shortcut to the servants' stairs. The room was suffocatingly dark, smelling of old paper, leather, and stale tobacco. Halfway across the Persian rug, her foot caught on something heavy. A discarded heavy crystal tumbler left right in the middle of the floor. Sophia stumbled. She didn't have the reflexes to catch herself. The heavy plastic caddy slipped from her grip, clattering loudly against the wood floor, sending bottles of cleaner and wet rags rolling into the darkness. Sophia hit the ground hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. She lay there on the rug. The pain in her shoulder throbbed, but strangely, the floor felt incredibly soft. I'll just close my eyes for 1 second, she thought, the cynical voice in her head finally drowned out by sheer biological exhaustion. Just until the pain stops. She didn't get up. The dark swallowed her whole. Declan Walsh was not asleep. He hadn't slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 6 months. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in his study, a glass of lukewarm tap water in his hand, watching the rain lash against the reinforced glass. He was 32, but his bones felt 80. The meeting tonight had been a disaster. The O'Connor faction was getting bold, pushing into the docks, testing his boundaries. He had been forced to make an example of one of their messengers. It was brutal. It was necessary. It was exhausting. He set the glass down on his desk, wincing slightly as the fabric of his shirt pulled against the bruised skin of his ribs. He unbuttoned his collar, discarding his tie onto the back of a leather chair. His head pounded with a vicious migraine that pulsed behind his left eye. He needed the ledgers from the 2024 shipments to cross-reference a discrepancy he'd noticed during the shouting match downstairs. The files were in the secondary library. Declan walked out of his study, his footsteps silent on the thick runners. The house was a tomb. It was his tomb, really. He had built it, fortified it, and now he was trapped inside it. He paid dozens of people to keep it running. An invisible army of staff that scurried away whenever he entered a room. He preferred it that way. Eye contact meant acknowledging their humanity, and he couldn't afford to care about collateral damage. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the library. He didn't bother turning on the main chandelier, opting instead to let the weak moonlight and the hallway spill guide him toward the filing cabinets. He took 3 steps into the room and stopped. His instincts, honed by a lifetime of paranoia, flared. Someone was in the room. He didn't reach for the gun holstered at his hip. The breathing was too slow, too shallow to be an assassin. Declan squinted into the gloom. Near the center of the room, surrounded by a spilled assortment of spray bottles and sponges, lay a crumpled heap of gray fabric. He moved closer, his guard dropping into sheer confusion. It was one of the maids. She was curled onto her side on the Persian rug, her knees pulled up slightly toward her chest. Her dark hair was out of its neat bun, spilling across her cheek. Her face was pale, nearly translucent in the dim light, with bruised purple exhaustion carved deep under her eyes. Declan stood over her, perfectly still. He recognized her vaguely. She was the one who never looked down when he passed her in the halls, but never looked directly at him either. She looked right through him, like he was a piece of ugly furniture. He found it mildly irritating. and therefore memorable. "Hey," he said. His voice was a harsh rasp, unused since he had barked orders 2 hours ago. She didn't stir. Declan frowned. He crouched down, the joints in his knees cracking. He reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering over her shoulder. He gave her a firm shake. "Wake up! You can't sleep here." Her head lolled slightly, but her eyes remained firmly shut. Her breathing was heavy, the slow, rhythmic drag of someone whose body had completely shut down. Declan withdrew his hand. He looked at the spilled cleaning supplies. He looked at her hands, resting limply on the rug. Her knuckles were raw, the skin cracked and peeling from harsh chemicals. Her fingernails were clipped ruthlessly short. A strange, uncomfortable sensation twisted in his gut. It wasn't pity. Pity was a useless emotion. It was recognition. He knew what it looked like to run until the engine seized. He saw it in the mirror every morning. This woman hadn't just fallen asleep. Her body had collapsed under the weight of the life she was carrying. A life, he realized with a cynical twist of his mouth, that involved cleaning up his messes. He should wake the head housekeeper, let her deal with it. It was inappropriate for him to intervene. He was the boss of a crime syndicate, not a babysitter. Declan stood up. He turned his back on her and walked toward the filing cabinet. He grabbed the ledger he needed. He turned to leave. He stopped at the doorway. He looked back at the small, gray form on the floor. The library was freezing. He swore under his breath, a harsh, clipped curse. He tossed the ledger onto a nearby table. Declan walked back to her. He didn't overthink it. He bent down, sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. He expected her to wake up in a panic, to scream or flail. Instead, as he lifted her, she merely sighed, her head falling naturally against his chest. She weighed next to nothing. It was alarming how light she was. She felt like a bundle of hollow bones wrapped in a cheap uniform. Declan adjusted his grip. She smelled like bleach, lemon polish, and faint, cheap vanilla soap. It was the most grounded, normal thing he had smelled in weeks. He carried her out of the library. He bypassed the servant stairs. They were too narrow, and he wasn't about to navigate them in the dark. He carried her up the sweeping main staircase, his boots making no sound on the carpet. He walked down the east corridor of the guest wing. He kicked open the door to the first suite. The room was spotless, the bed made with crisp, suffocatingly tight corners. Declan walked to the bed. He didn't bother pulling back the thick duvet. He simply laid her down on top of it. He started to pull his arms away. As he shifted his weight to stand, her hand twitched. Her fingers, rough and cold, closed around his wrist. Declan froze. He looked down. She wasn't awake. Her eyes were still shut tight, but her grip was desperate, anchoring him to the spot. It was a reflex, a dying grip on a lifeline. He stared at her hand on his wrist. He could easily pull away. He could break her grip with a flick of his arm. He didn't. Declan looked at the empty armchair in the corner of the room. He looked back at the maid. He exhaled a long, ragged breath, dragged the armchair to the side of the bed with his free hand, and sat down. Sophia woke to the sensation of drowning in a cloud. It was a slow, confusing ascent to consciousness. Usually, she woke up to the screech of her phone alarm, the agonizing stiffness in her back, and the drafty chill of her cramped apartment. Today, she felt warmth. A heavy, expensive kind of warmth. She kept her eyes closed for a moment, letting her brain boot up. Her shoulder ached dully. Her feet throbbed. She remembered the library, the spilled caddy, the floor. Her eyes snapped open. The ceiling was wrong. It wasn't the water-stained plaster of her bedroom. It was high, vaulted, and painted a stark, pristine white with intricate crown molding. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She sat up violently, her breath catching in her throat. She was on a bed the size of a small island. Silk pillows, a heavy down duvet. She tried to scramble backward to get off the mattress, but her right arm yanked tight, stopping her dead. Sophia looked down. Her hand was swallowed by another, large, deeply tanned, with knuckles scarred white and a heavy gold watch cutting into the wrist. She traced the arm attached to the hand. Up the rolled-up sleeve of a white dress shirt, across a broad expanse of chest, rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Up to a face that made the bottom drop out of her stomach. Declan Walsh. He was slumped in a velvet armchair, pulled flush against the side of the bed. His head was tilted back at an uncomfortable angle, his dark hair messy, a shadow of stubble rough on his jaw. He was fast asleep, and he was holding her hand. No, Sophia realized with a jolt of pure horror. Her fingers were curled tightly around his palm, and his fingers were draped loosely over hers. She was holding his hand. Her mind raced, cycling through a Rolodex of catastrophic scenarios. Did she sleepwalk? Did she attack him? Was she going to be buried in the foundation of a new casino? She needed to extract her hand. Slowly, Sophia held her breath. She relaxed her fingers, moving with the agonizing slowness of someone trying to disarm a bomb. She slid her index finger out, then her middle finger. She was almost free. The moment her hand began to slip from his palm, Declan's fingers snapped shut, locking her back in place. His eyes opened. They weren't groggy. There was no slow blinking or confused staring. His eyes went from completely shut to violently awake in a fraction of a second. They were a pale, icy blue, and they locked onto her face with terrifying intensity. Sophia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Declan stared at her. He didn't move. He didn't let go of her hand. The silence in the room was heavy, thick enough to choke on. Sophia started, her voice cracking. Her throat was bone dry. She swallowed hard and tried again, channeling every ounce of cynical bravery she possessed. I can explain. Declan slowly sat up straighter in the chair, rolling his neck. It popped loudly. He looked down at their joined hands. Can you? He asked. His voice was gravel, low and flat. I slipped, Sophia said, rushing the words out. In the library, I dropped my caddy and I fell and I think I passed out. Declan's thumb casually brushed against the raw skin of her knuckles. It wasn't a caress. It was an assessment. I know, I found you. Sophia's brain stuttered. You brought me here? You were bleeding on a 300-year-old rug, he lied smoothly. I didn't want a stain. Sophia looked at her hands, her arms. There was no blood. She looked back at him, her brow furrowing. I'm not bleeding. Declan held her gaze, entirely unbothered by being caught in a lie. You looked like a corpse. It was depressing the room. Sophia didn't know what to do with that. The boss of the city's most feared syndicate was sitting in a chair, holding her hand, throwing dry insults at her. Sir, she said, her tone dropping into the formal, detached register she used for the staff managers. I apologize for the inconvenience. If you let go of my hand, I will get back to work, or pack my things if I'm fired. Declan looked at her mouth, then back up to her eyes. You think I brought you up here to fire you? I think men like you don't do things without a reason, Sophia said, surprising herself with her own bluntness. The fear was receding, replaced by a bizarre, surreal exhaustion. And I don't have anything you want, so I'm assuming I'm a liability. Declan's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. He smelled like expensive scotch, rain, and something inherently dangerous. You grabbed me, he stated, ignoring her assessment of his character. Sophia flushed. I was asleep. I didn't know what I was doing. You held on like you were falling off a cliff. I apologize. I tried to leave, Declan continued, his voice dropping a fraction lower, softer, yet somehow more intimidating. You wouldn't let go. Sophia yanked her hand hard. This time, he let her go. She pulled her arm back to her chest, rubbing her own wrist. There, she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. I let go. I'll get my things. She threw her legs over the side of the bed, planting her feet on the thick rug. She stood up. Her legs wobbled instantly, a sharp spike of pain shooting up her spine. She pitched forward. Before she could hit the floor, Declan was there. He moved with terrifying speed, his hands clamped onto her waist, holding her steady. His grip was entirely different this time, not a passive anchor, but a cage of solid muscle. Sophia gasped, her hands flying up to press flat against his chest. She could feel the hard ridge of his ribs beneath the thin cotton of his shirt. Declan looked down at her. He was a head taller, his broad frame blocking out the morning light from the window. Sit down, he ordered quietly. I need to leave, Sophia countered, tilting her head back to glare at him. My shift ended 6 hours ago. Sit down. He didn't raise his voice, but the command carried the weight of a physical blow. He effortlessly lifted her backward, depositing her back onto the edge of the mattress. He didn't step away. He stood between her knees, crowding her space, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was something entirely too focused. What is your name? He asked. Sophia stared at his collarbone. Sophia. Sophia Reed. Sophia, he repeated. The way he said it made it sound heavy. How many hours a week do you work in this house, Sophia? 80, she lied. It was closer to 90. And before you passed out in my library, Declan said, his gaze dropping to the dark circles under her eyes. When was the last time you slept? That isn't your concern, Mr. Walsh. A muscle feathered in his jaw. I make it my concern when my staff start dropping dead in my hallways. I didn't drop dead. I was resting. You were comatose. Declan finally took a half step back, giving her a fraction of breathing room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black phone. He dialed a single number and put it to his ear. Gable, he barked into the receiver. Bring breakfast to the East Wing guest suite, 2 plates, and cancel Sophia Reed's shifts for the next week, with pay. He hung up before the housekeeper could respond and tossed the phone onto the bed. Sophia stared at him, her mouth slightly open. You can't do that. If I don't work, I just said with pay, Declan interrupted coldly. He walked back to the velvet armchair and sat down heavily, resting his elbows on his knees, watching her. You aren't leaving this room until you eat. And you aren't leaving this house until you don't look like a stiff. Sophia gripped the edge of the mattress. Why are you doing this? Declan looked away, staring out the window at the gray morning light. The hard, ruthless mask of the boss slid back into place, locking away whatever brief moment of humanity had compelled him to carry her upstairs. Because, Declan said softly, his voice devoid of emotion. I hate cleaning up messes, and you were about to become a very inconvenient one. The knock on the door was sharp and hesitant, a rhythm that betrayed the anxiety of the person standing on the other side. Come in, Declan called out. He didn't raise his voice, but the acoustic design of the estate carried the command perfectly. The heavy door clicked open. Mrs. Gable, a woman who usually moved through the house with the militant authority of an army general, froze in the threshold. She was balancing a heavy silver tray laden with covered plates, a carafe of coffee, and fresh juice. Her eyes darted from Declan, sitting casually in the velvet armchair, to Sophia, sitting stiffly on the edge of the immense bed. For 3 seconds, Mrs. Gable's face was a masterclass in suppressed shock. Then, the neutral mask of a seasoned head housekeeper slammed into place. Put it on the table, Declan instructed, gesturing to a small glass-topped table near the window. Mrs. Gable obeyed in total silence. The porcelain clinked faintly as she set the tray down. She didn't look at Sophia. That was worse, Sophia thought. The active avoidance of eye contact meant Mrs. Gable was already drawing conclusions, and none of them involved Sophia accidentally passing out from exhaustion. Will there be anything else, sir? Mrs. Gable asked, her hands clasped tightly in front of her crisp apron. No, make sure no one comes down this corridor until I say otherwise. That includes security. Understood. Mrs. Gable gave a stiff nod, turned on her heel, and exited, pulling the door shut with a soft, final click. Sophia felt the remaining air suck out of the room. She was entirely alone with him again. Declan stood. The sudden movement made Sophia flinch backward, her shoulders hitting the silk pillows. He ignored the reaction, walking over to the table and lifting the silver cloches. The smell of bacon, buttered toast, and rich coffee flooded the room. Usually, the smell of hot food would make Sophia's mouth water. Today, her stomach twisted into a tight, hard knot. Nausea, fueled by adrenaline and sheer fatigue, clawed up her throat. Declan picked up a plate, grabbed a fork, and walked back to the bed. He held it out to her. Eat! Sophia looked at the plate. Scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, roasted tomatoes. It was more food than she typically ate in 2 days. I'm not hungry. I didn't ask if you were hungry, Declan said smoothly. He didn't lower the plate. I said eat. Your blood sugar is on the floor. You look like you're going to pass out again. And if you do, I'm not carrying you to a hospital. Sophia gritted her teeth. She snatched the plate from his hand, careful not to let their fingers brush. She placed it on her lap, staring down at the eggs. Declan walked back to the table, poured a cup of black coffee for himself, and leaned against the windowsill. He took a slow sip, watching her over the rim of the cup. Sophia picked up the fork. Her hand was shaking. She hated it, but she couldn't stop the fine tremor in her fingers. She managed to get a piece of toast to her mouth. It tasted like ash, but she chewed mechanically and forced it down. 80 hours, Declan said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. Sophia paused, the fork hovering over her plate. What? You said you work 80 hours, but my payroll manager runs a tight ship. He doesn't authorize overtime without my signature, which means your ghosting shifts. Sophia set the fork down. The cynical edge she kept honed for the streets flared back to life. I swap badges with the night staff. Maria needs to be home with her kids, so I take her shifts and she gives me the cash. It gets the floors clean, doesn't it? Declan didn't blink. It circumvents my security protocols. I need to know exactly who is in my house at all times. I'm scrubbing baseboards, Mr. Walsh, not planting bugs. Sophia crossed her arms over her chest, immediately regretting the motion as it pulled the fabric of her uniform tight across her aching shoulders. If you want to fire me for it, just do it. Stop playing this game. If I wanted to fire you, Reed, you'd be walking in the rain right now. Declan set his coffee cup down on the sill. He crossed his arms, mirroring her posture, though on him, the stance looked entirely predatory. You're hiding from something, or you're working off a debt. Nobody scrubs blood out of a hardwood floor at 3 a.m. just to pay rent. Sophia's breath hitched. She looked away, staring at the intricate pattern of the duvet. He was right, and it terrified her that he could read her that easily. Eat the eggs, Declan said, his tone softening a fraction, though the command remained. Then sleep. The door is unlocked. But if I find you downstairs with a mop in your hand before next week, I won't be giving you a paid vacation. I'll throw you out myself. He pushed off the windowsill and walked toward the door. Why do you care? Sophia asked, her voice cracking slightly in the empty room. Declan paused with his hand on the brass doorknob. He looked back at her. The shadows of the hallway caught the harsh angles of his face. You're a fixture in my house, he said flatly. I expect my fixtures to be in working order. He stepped out and shut the door. The study was located in the opposite wing, a room built entirely of dark mahogany, leather, and soundproofed glass. Declan sat behind the massive desk, rubbing his thumb hard against his temple. The migraine was back, pulsing with steady, vindictive rhythm. The door opened without a knock. Only one person in the organization had that privilege. Finn stepped into the room, tossing a thin manila folder onto the center of Declan's blotter. Finn was lean, sharply dressed, and possessed the casual, relaxed demeanor of a man who was very comfortable committing violence. Sophia Reed, Finn said, dropping into one of the guest chairs and stretching his long legs out. 24. Clean record. No affiliations with the O'Connors, no ties to the docks, just a civilian. Declan opened the folder. The first page was a copy of her driver's license. She looked younger in the photo, her face fuller, the exhausting shadows under her eyes absent. And the debt? Declan asked, his eyes scanning the background check. It's ugly, Finn said, leaning his head back. She had an older sister, leukemia, uninsured. The sister died 8 months ago, but before she did, they ran out of conventional options. Sophia co-signed a loan to pay for experimental treatments at a private clinic. Declan flipped the page. He stopped at a ledger sheet Finn had acquired from a shadow contact. He looked at the name at the top of the column. Tommy Sullivan. Declan let out a slow, sharp exhale. Tommy Sullivan was a mid-level loan shark operating out of the South Side. A bottom feeder. He lent money to desperate people with impossible interest rates, and when they couldn't pay, he squeezed them for assets, or worse, forced them into his less legitimate businesses. How much? Declan asked. 80 grand on paper. But with Sullivan's vig, she's paying $3,000 a month just to keep him from breaking her legs. She's not even touching the principal. She's working 3 jobs, Declan. The Maid gig here, a diner on 4th Street, and night shift stocking at a grocer. She's a machine. Declan stared at the numbers. The strange, uncomfortable feeling in his chest returned. It wasn't empathy. He didn't do empathy. It was territorial aggression. Sophia Reed worked in his house. She scrubbed his floors. She had passed out on his carpet. And some two-bit thug from the south side was driving her into the ground, bleeding her dry while she bled onto Declan's Persian rugs. It offended his sense of order. "Sullivan is getting bold," Declan said quietly, closing the folder. Finn raised an eyebrow. "Sullivan doesn't know she works here. She's contracted through an agency. It's a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidence." Declan stood up, walking over to the small, wet bar in the corner to pour 2 fingers of scotch. "Sullivan has been pushing his collections territory north. He's putting his hands on people in my district." Finn sat up straighter, the relaxed posture vanishing. "You want me to send a message?" "No." Declan took a sip of the scotch, letting the burn cut through the fatigue. "I want you to buy the paper." Finn blinked. "Buy Sophia Reed's debt? Full principal. Pay him off. Tell him if he ever contacts her or steps foot north of the river again, I'll personally nail his hands to his own desk." "Declan, we aren't a charity. If you buy the debt, you hold the debt. What are you going to do, garnish a maid's wages for the next 30 years? "Just get it done, Finn." Declan's tone booked no argument. It was the voice that ended discussions and started wars. Finn held his hands up in surrender, standing. "Consider it done. Sullivan will piss himself when he sees the wire transfer." He paused at the door, looking back at his boss. "You know, if you wanted to fire her for working 80 hours, there's cheaper ways to do it." "She isn't fired," Declan said, turning his back to look out the window. "I have a new job for her." Sophia woke to total darkness. For a terrifying second, she didn't know where she was. She scrambled backward, her hands tangling in the thick duvet, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then the smell of expensive laundry detergent and faint rain hit her, and the memories of the morning flooded back. She fumbled for the bedside lamp, clicking it on. The soft, warm light illuminated the immaculate guest room. The tray of food was gone. In its place, a neatly folded stack of clothes sat on the glass-topped table. Sophia swung her legs out of bed. Her body ached, but the sharp stabbing pain in her spine had dulled to a manageable throb. She checked the heavy brass clock on the mantel. 8:00 p.m. She had slept for over 12 hours. She hadn't slept for 12 consecutive hours since she was a teenager. She walked over to the table. The clothes were simple: a pair of dark, high-waisted trousers, a soft gray cashmere sweater, and clean undergarments with the tags still attached. Beneath the clothes was a note written in sharp, aggressive handwriting: shower, dress, office. DW. Sophia stared at the note. Her cynical brain analyzed the situation. She was rested, which meant she could run. The house was massive. She knew the servant exits. But running meant going back to her freezing apartment, facing Sullivan's collectors on Friday, and losing the best-paying job she had ever held. She didn't have a choice. Poverty was a cage, and Declan Walsh had just offered her a slightly larger, padded version of it. She took a shower in the ensuite bathroom. The water pressure was incredible, hot enough to turn her skin pink and melt the remaining tension from her shoulders. She used a heavy cedar-scented soap she found in the glass stall, avoiding the mirror when she stepped out. She didn't want to see the hollow look in her own eyes. She dressed quickly, The clothes fit perfectly, which unsettled her deeply. The cashmere was ridiculously soft against her skin, a stark contrast to the stiff, scratchy polyester of her maid uniform. Sophia walked out of the guest suite. The house was quiet, the evening staff moving silently through the lower floors. She knew where the office was. She had never been inside, but she knew the heavy oak doors at the end of the West Wing corridor. She stood outside the doors, took a deep breath, and knocked twice. "Enter." Sophia pushed the door open. The office was dimly lit by a single desk lamp. Declan was sitting behind the desk, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the thick scars wrapping around his left forearm. He was reviewing a stack of paperwork. He didn't look up immediately. He let her stand there, letting the silence stretch, establishing the dynamic. Finally, he closed a file and leaned back in his chair. He looked at her, really looked at her. His eyes tracked from the hem of the trousers up to the gray sweater, lingering for a fraction of a second on her neck before meeting her eyes. "Sit," he gestured to the leather chair across from him. Sophia walked forward, her footsteps muffled by the thick rug. She sat down, keeping her spine rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I bought your debt," Declan said. He didn't ease into it. He dropped the bomb with the casual indifference of a man discussing the weather. Sophia stopped breathing. The blood roared in her ears. What?" Declan pushed a single piece of paper across the desk. It was a release form, stamped and signed by Tommy Sullivan's holding company. The balance was marked as 0. "Sullivan is out of the picture," Declan continued, his voice low and steady. "He won't call you. His collectors won't show up at your apartment. The 80,000 is gone." Sophia stared at the paper. She didn't reach for it. She knew better than to believe in miracles. Miracles were just traps set by people with better leverage. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her iron grip on her composure. "You don't know me. I'm a maid." "You were a maid," Declan corrected. "I don't employ maids who owe money to bottom-feeding loan sharks. It makes them vulnerable to bribery. It makes them a security risk in my house." "So, you fired me by paying off $80,000. Sophia let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "I know how this works, Mr. Walsh. Men like you don't do favors. What do I owe you now?" Declan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. The space between them suddenly felt incredibly small. "You owe me exactly what I paid," Declan said. "But I don't charge interest, and I don't break legs. How am I supposed to pay you back if I don't have a job?" "I didn't say you didn't have a job. I said you aren't a maid anymore." Declan pulled another folder from a drawer and opened it. "This house is too large. My staff is too large. I don't trust half the people on my payroll. Mrs. Gable is competent, but she gossips with the cooks. I need someone who knows how to be invisible, someone who notices when things are out of place." Sophia frowned, her confusion warring with her suspicion. "You want me to spy on your staff?" "I want you to manage my private quarters," Declan replied smoothly. "My office, my bedroom, the secured wing, areas the general staff are forbidden from entering. You will clean them. You will organize them. You will report directly to me and only to me. In exchange, your salary triples. A portion of that goes toward your debt every month until it's clear." Sophia stared at him. It was a lifeline. It was a massive, impossibly thick lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. but the rope was tied to a shark. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could hire a professional, someone with clearance." Declan looked at her hands, still tightly clasped in her lap. He remembered the desperate iron grip she had on his wrist in the morning. He remembered the raw, peeling skin of her knuckles. "Because you fell asleep on a hardwood floor surrounded by bleach rather than ask for a break," Declan said, his gaze snapping back up to lock onto hers. "You have a survival instinct, Sophia. I respect survival, and I trust a cynic over a professional any day of the week." He pulled a black pen from his pocket and set it on top of the contract he had placed next to Sullivan's release form. "Sign it," Declan ordered softly. "Move your things out of that freezing apartment and into the staff quarters here. Stop running yourself into the ground for people who don't care if you die." Sophia looked at the pen. She looked at the man offering it. He was dangerous. He was lethal. He was the boss of a criminal empire. But right now, he was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. Slowly, Sophia reached out. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of the pen. She didn't look away from Declan's icy blue eyes as she pulled the contract toward her. She was trading one monster for another, but at least this one provided cashmere and a warm bed. She uncapped the pen and signed her name. The transition from the downstairs servants' quarters to the master wing was like crossing an invisible border into a different country. Downstairs, the house was a hive of quiet, anxious energy. Maids whispering in Spanish and English, the clatter of industrial dishwashers, the sharp smell of commercial bleach. Upstairs, the silence was absolute. Sophia moved into a room adjacent to Declan's private office. It was meant for a live-in valet, a position Declan had apparently never filled. The bed was a full size, the mattress thick and supportive. There was a window that looked out over the sprawling manicured gardens, not the brick wall of an alleyway. For the first 3 nights, Sophia woke up every 2 hours in a cold sweat, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She waited for a knock on the door, demanding payment in a currency darker than cleaning. The knock never came. Instead, a bizarre, solitary routine established itself. Sophia was no longer a ghost haunting the house. She was the ghost haunting Declan Walsh. Her instructions were simple, delivered via a typed memo left on her small desk. Clean the office, the master bedroom, the private gym, and the secondary library. Do it when I am not there. Touch nothing in the safe. Throw away any glass that isn't completely empty. The work itself took less than 4 hours a day. Compared to her old 80-hour weeks, it felt like early retirement. But the psychological weight of the job was immensely heavier. She was inside the fortress now. She saw the cracks in the walls. Sophia learned the shape of Declan's life through the things he left behind. She learned he preferred a specific brand of scotch, not for the taste, but because it burned the throat enough to keep him awake. She learned he paced when he was angry, leaving faint, repetitive indentations in the plush carpet near the window. She learned he owned an arsenal of tailored suits, but often discarded the jackets on the floor, the silk linings carrying the faint smell of gunpowder and stale cigar smoke from backroom meetings. And she learned he was bleeding out, not physically, but mentally. It was a Tuesday night, nearly 1 a.m. Sophia was in his office, polishing the mahogany desk. She thought he was out. The security detail hadn't signaled his return. She was humming softly under her breath, a habit she'd picked up from her late sister, moving a microfiber cloth over the heavy brass lamp. The heavy oak door opened without a sound. Sophia froze, her hand hovering over the wood. Declan stood in the doorway. He looked wrecked. His tie was gone, the top 3 buttons of his shirt undone. A dark, ugly bruise was blooming along his left jawline, disappearing into his collar. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the wet bar, poured a heavy measure of scotch, and downed it in one fluid motion. "I apologize, sir," Sophia said, her voice dropping into the quiet, professional register. "I thought you were off the premises. I'll leave." Declan poured another glass. He finally turned his head. His icy blue eyes were bloodshot, the exhaustion hanging off him like a wet overcoat. "Stay," he said. The word was rough, scraping against his throat. Sophia hesitated. She clutched the microfiber cloth in her hand. "Do you need me to clean something?" "No." He walked over to the leather chair behind his desk and collapsed into it. The leather groaned under his weight. He rested his elbows on the polished wood she had just cleaned and buried his face in his large hands. "Just stay. Don't talk.